The examination hall stretched out like a small stadium, filled with creatures that Kim Hanul had only seen in textbooks back on Earth. He adjusted his position in the uncomfortable metal chair and tried not to stare at the student sitting 3 rows ahead of him. The creature had 4 massive arms, each one the size of a tree trunk, and skin that looked like gray stone. Its breathing sounded like distant thunder. Hanul wiped his sweaty palms on his pants. He was the only human in a room of 200 students, and he felt it. Every eye, tentacle, and sensor seemed to glance his way at some point. Some looks were curious, others dismissive. A few seemed almost pitying. The Andromeda Institute of Higher Learning was supposed to be the best university in this part of the galaxy. Hanul still could not believe he had gotten accepted to their exchange program. His grades back on Earth were good, but nothing special. He was just a regular kid from Seoul who liked math and science. A low hum filled the air as Professor Vax entered the hall. The Krillian moved with careful steps, his 6 eyes scanning the room like searchlights. Each eye was the size of a tennis ball, set in a triangular pattern on his blue-scaled head. His voice came out in perfect standard Galactic, though Hanul could hear the slight clicking sounds that meant the professor was using a translation device. "Today you face the Cognitive Reasoning Matrix evaluation," Professor Vax announced. His voice echoed through the hall without any need for speakers. For 300 years, this test has measured the highest levels of mathematical thinking in known space. The average completion rate across all species is 12%. A ripple of nervous energy moved through the room. The crystalline student next to Hanul began making soft chiming sounds, which he had learned meant anxiety in Vethari body language. Behind him, someone with too many joints was clicking what might have been claws or fingers against their desk. "Professor." Vax continued his speech, but Hanul was having trouble focusing. His grandmother's voice kept echoing in his head from their last video call before he left Earth. "Remember, Hanula, you are smart in your own way. Do not let these aliens make you feel small." Park Mi-young had raised him after his parents died in a hovercar accident when he was 12. She was a retired math teacher who had spent her evenings teaching him puzzles and games. "A good mind is like a good tool," she always said. "It works best when you use it the way it was made to work." "The test will now begin," Professor Vax said. "You have exactly 2 hours. Failure to complete at least 10% will result in immediate academic probation. Failure to complete any portion may result in psychological counseling, as the cognitive strain has been known to cause lasting mental effects." Quantum tablets rose from slots in each desk. The screens flickered to life, showing what looked like terms of agreement in dozens of languages. Hanul pressed his thumb to the human section, accepting responsibility for any mental damage the test might cause. The screen went black for a moment, then filled with the most complex-looking mathematical display Hanul had ever seen. Symbols, twisted and curved in ways that hurt to look at directly. Numbers seemed to shift between different numerical systems. Greek letters mixed with alien script that looked like tiny explosions frozen in time. Around the room, gasps and groans filled the air. The 4-armed student made a sound like grinding stone. Someone behind Hanul was breathing so fast it sounded like a broken engine. The crystalline Vethari next to him had stopped chiming entirely and was now glowing a worried shade of orange. Hanul stared at his screen and blinked. Then he blinked again. Buried under all the fancy symbols and confusing notation was something very familiar. He could see a grid, 9 squares by 9 squares. Some of the squares had numbers in them, others were empty. The numbers went from 1 to 9. It looked exactly like the Sudoku puzzles his grandmother had taught him to solve. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. The alien symbols were confusing, but once he started ignoring them and focusing on the underlying structure, it became clearer. The curved symbols that looked so alien were just the numbers 1 through 9 written in some old Earth notation he had seen in ancient math books. The quantum uncertainty matrices that the instructions mentioned were just empty squares waiting to be filled in. Hanul looked around the room. Every other student was frantically taking notes, using calculation devices, or staring at their screens with expressions of pure terror. A student with tentacles instead of arms was writing equations so fast that his appendages were blurring. The four-armed creature had activated some kind of holographic computer that was projecting complex, three-dimensional math models into the air. But to Hanul, this was just a puzzle his 70-year-old grandmother could solve while watching television and drinking tea. He picked up the stylus and started filling in numbers. Square by square, row by row, he used the same simple logic Grandmother Park had taught him. If a row already had the numbers 1, 3, and 7, then those numbers could not go anywhere else in that row. If a column had 2, 4, and 9, then no other square in that column could have those numbers. It was the same game he had played thousands of times, sometimes on paper torn from old magazines, sometimes on his phone during boring subway rides to school. The student next to him was now glowing bright red and making sounds like a broken fire alarm. Across the room, someone was crying. The sound was unlike anything Hanul had heard before, like wind blowing through a broken flute, but he could tell it was crying. Professor Vax walked between the rows, his 6 eyes taking in the scene. When he passed Hanul's desk, he paused. One of his eyes focused on the human screen, while the others continued scanning the room. Hanul could feel the professor's attention like a weight on his shoulders, but he kept working. More squares filled in. The logic was exactly the same as every Sudoku puzzle he had ever solved. Look at what numbers are missing, figure out where they can go, eliminate the impossible choices, and fill in the obvious ones. When that stopped working, make a reasonable guess and see if it led to a solution or a contradiction. Around him, the sounds of academic panic grew louder. Someone was hitting their desk repeatedly. The crystalline student's glow was now cycling between orange, red, and a sickly yellow-green color that probably meant nausea. The four-armed student had given up on his holographic computer and was now staring at the ceiling with an expression that needed no translation. Hanul filled in another number, then another. His grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in his ear. "Do not rush, Hanula. Let your mind work the way it knows how to work." He had no idea that he was about to accidentally solve the galaxy's most famous unsolvable problem. He was just a kid from Earth doing a puzzle, thinking about his grandmother's patient voice and the warm summer afternoons when she had first shown him how numbers could dance together in perfect harmony. The timer on his screen showed 90 minutes remaining. At this rate, he would be done in 20 minutes. Professor Vax tried to focus on the other students, but his eyes kept drifting back to the human. Kim Hanul was working with a calmness that made no sense. While every other student in the room showed signs of severe cognitive stress, the young human looked like he was solving a children's puzzle. The professor had administered the cognitive reasoning matrix evaluation over 40 times in his career. He had seen the best and brightest minds from across the galaxy attempt this test. Quellian hive minds with collective intelligence spanning thousands of individuals. Nexarian scholars who could calculate quantum probabilities in their heads. Therion savants who thought in pure mathematics. None of them had ever looked relaxed while taking the CRME. Vax watched as Hanel filled in another symbol without any visible calculation or note-taking. The humans' movements were quick and confident, like someone filling out a form with information they already knew. It was impossible. Across the room, Kira, a normally brilliant Gorvani student, was showing classic signs of mathematical breakdown. Her 4 massive arms were trembling, and she was making the low humming sound that meant her brain was overheating. Vax had seen it before. In about 10 minutes, she would either go into protective shutdown or start screaming. 2 rows behind her, Jorik and Ven, a pair of Arcturian twins who shared a telepathic connection, had given up entirely. They were sitting with their heads in their hands, their silver skin flickering between colors that indicated confusion and defeat. Even with their linked minds, they had managed to complete less than 3% of the test. The Vethari student next to Hanol Nexes was cycling through colors so rapidly that Vax worried she might shatter. Vethari were crystalline beings who processed information through harmonic resonance, and her internal frequency was clearly approaching dangerous levels. Her body was making sounds like wind chimes in a hurricane. But the human just kept filling, in numbers. Vax approached Hanol's desk again, this time positioning himself where he could see the screen clearly. What he saw made his 6 eyes widen in disbelief. The test was more than half complete. Every answer was correct. This was impossible for so many reasons that Vax's trained academic mind began cycling through explanations. Perhaps the human had some kind of cybernetic enhancement that the admission scans had missed. Maybe his species had developed some unknown form of mathematical processing. Or possibly this was some elaborate cheating scheme involving quantum communication with Earth-based computers. The professor activated his personal scanner, pointing it discreetly at Hanil. The device was designed to detect any form of technological assistance or biological enhancement. The readout showed a completely normal human brain operating within standard parameters. No implants, no quantum communication devices, no genetic modifications. Just an ordinary young man solving the galaxy's most difficult test like it was a newspaper puzzle. Around the examination hall, the sounds of academic distress were growing louder. Rix, a tentacled cephalian known for his mathematical genius, was making a noise like steam escaping from a broken pipe. His tentacles were writing equations in the air so fast they were becoming tangled. Professor Talon, a fellow Krillian who was observing from the back of the room, approached Vax with concern radiating from her scales. She spoke in their native, clicking language which the translation devices would not pick up. "Something is wrong with the human student," she said. "His brain activity readings are all wrong. He shows no signs of cognitive strain whatsoever." Vax clicked back quietly. "I know. Either he is the most remarkable mathematical genius in galactic history, or something very strange is happening." They both looked back at Hanul, who was now 3/4 of the way through the test. His expression was one of mild concentration, like someone trying to remember where they had left their keys. There was no sign of the intense mental effort that the CRME was supposed to require. Meanwhile, the rest of the room was descending into chaos. A student from the Helix Nebula had started making a sound like a dying star. 3 different species were exhibiting signs of protective cognitive shutdown. The air recycling system was working overtime to handle all the stress pheromones heat signatures, and electromagnetic disturbances being generated by panicking alien brains. Nexes, the Vithari next to Hanal, finally cracked. Her crystalline body flashed bright white, and she let out a harmonic scream that made every piece of glass in the room vibrate. 2 medical drones immediately deployed from ceiling compartments and began administering cognitive stabilizers. Hanil looked up from his test with concern. "Is she okay?" he asked Professor Vax. The question was asked in the same tone someone might use to inquire about a classmate who had sneezed. There was no understanding in the human's voice that he was witnessing a complete academic breakdown, brought on by exposure to mathematical complexity beyond most species' ability to process. "She will recover," Vax said carefully. "The test can be challenging." Hanul nodded and went back to his work. Vax noticed that the human had paused to show concern for a fellow student even while taking the most important academic assessment of his life. Most species became so focused during the CRME that they lost awareness of their surroundings entirely. With 15 minutes left in the testing period, Hanul set down his stylus and leaned back in his chair. He looked around the room with mild curiosity, watching the ongoing academic carnage with the expression of someone waiting for a bus. Professor Vax realized that the human had finished the test, the complete test, the test that no being in 300 years had ever finished. Vax approached the desk on unsteady legs. His 6 eyes focused on the screen, scanning every line of the solution. He ran the verification protocols twice, then 3 times. Every answer was correct. Every constraint was satisfied. The mathematical proof was flawless. "Impossible," he whispered in his native language. Hanul heard the sound and looked up politely. "I'm sorry, Professor. Did you say something?" Vax stared at the young human. "You have completed the assessment." "Yes, sir." Was I supposed to wait until time was up? Hanul looked genuinely concerned that he had broken some rule. Around them, students were still struggling with the first few sections of the test. Medical drones were tending to 3 different cases of cognitive overload. The air was filled with the sounds of mathematical suffering, and Kim Hanul was asking if he should have taken longer. Professor Vax felt something that his species rarely experienced: complete intellectual vertigo. Everything he understood about mathematics, about testing, about the fundamental limits of cognitive ability, had just been turned upside down by a 19-year-old human who looked like he had solved a crossword puzzle. "No," Vax managed to say. "No. You did not break any rules, but you might have broken something much more important," he thought. "You might have broken our understanding of what is possible." The timer reached 0. Around the room, quantum tablets went dark as the testing period ended. Most students had completed less than 10% of the assessment. The average completion rate looked like it would be even lower than usual, except for the human, who had achieved something that was supposed to be mathematically impossible. Professor Vax looked at Hanul's calm, friendly face and realized that his academic career was about to become very complicated indeed. While Professor Vax struggled to process what had just happened, Hanul sat quietly and thought about his grandmother's teaching methods. Park Mi-young had always made Sudoku seem like the most natural thing in the world. "Look at this square." "Hanula," she would say, pointing to an empty space in the puzzle. "What numbers are already in this row? What numbers are in this column? What numbers are in this little box of 9 squares? Now, what number is missing?" It had been that simple. Look at what was there, figure out what was missing, and fill in the gaps using logic. The test that had just broken the minds of 200 of the galaxy's brightest students was exactly the same puzzle. The only difference was that instead of calling the constraints rows, columns, and boxes, the instructions called them linear probability matrices, vertical dimensional arrays, and quantum localized subsystems. Instead of calling the empty spaces blanks to fill in, they were called undefined probability states requiring resolution. Instead of calling the numbers 1 through 9 numbers 1 through 9, they were written in symbols that looked alien but were actually just ancient human mathematical notation from old Earth textbooks. Hanul had recognized the symbols because his grandmother was old-fashioned and kept books from her own grandmother's time. Mathematical notation from the 2100s looked strange and fancy, but it was still just numbers. The test makers had probably found these old human symbols in some archaeological database and thought they looked appropriately mysterious and complex. They had no idea they were just using a different way to write simple digits. As Hanul sat waiting for whatever came next, he watched the other students slowly recovering from their ordeal. The four-armed Gorvani student, Kira, was being helped to her feet by medical assistants. Her stone-like skin had turned a pale gray color, and she was making soft rumbling sounds that seemed to indicate exhaustion. The Cephalian student, Rix, had tangled his tentacles so badly during his frantic equation writing that a maintenance drone was carefully unknotting them. His large eyes looked glazed over, like someone who had been staring at a bright light too long. Even the Quellian hive mind representatives, who usually moved with perfect coordination, were stumbling around like they had forgotten how to work together. Hanul had heard that severe cognitive strain could temporarily disrupt their mental connections. It made him feel a little guilty. These were clearly very smart beings who had worked hard to get into this university. They had probably spent years preparing for this test, studying advanced mathematics and cognitive theory, and Hanul had solved it using a technique his 70-year-old grandmother had taught him while they drank tea and watched afternoon dramas on television. The puzzle itself had been moderately difficult, about the same level as the ones in the Sunday newspaper back home. Not the easy Monday puzzles that beginners could solve, but not the expert-level ones that took hours of careful work either. If his little sister Jiwoo were here, she probably could have solved it too, though it might have taken her a bit longer. Professor Vax was having a quiet but intense conversation with several other faculty members who had arrived during the test. Hanul could see them gesturing toward him and checking data tablets with expressions of disbelief. He wondered if he had done something wrong. Maybe there was some cultural rule about finishing tests too quickly, or maybe the test had some kind of time minimum that he had violated. His thoughts were interrupted when a tall, elegant being approached his desk. She had skin that looked like polished silver and eyes that shifted between different colors as she moved. An Arcturian, Hanul realized, though he had never seen one this close before. "I am Dean Lysa Korthak," she said in perfect standard Galactic. "I oversee academic integrity at this institution. I need to ask you some questions about your test-taking methods." Hanul nodded politely. "Of course, Dean Korthak. Did I do something wrong?" The dean's eyes shifted to a deep blue color, which he thought might indicate concentration. "Can you explain how you approach the cognitive reasoning matrix evaluation?" "Well," Hanul said, trying to think of how to explain Sudoku to someone who had never seen one before. "I looked at each empty space and tried to figure out what number belonged there. You have to use the numbers 1 through 9, and each number can only appear once in each row, once in each column, and once in each small square section. Dean Korthak's eyes shifted to bright yellow. That is a very simplified description of a highly complex mathematical assessment. I guess so, Hanul said. But once you see the pattern, it's not really that hard. You just have to be systematic about it. Start with the spaces where only one number is possible, fill those in, and then see what new possibilities that creates. And you developed this approach yourself? Hanil thought about his grandmother's patient afternoon lessons. My grandmother taught me this method when I was young. She learned it from her grandmother. It's a very old technique on Earth. The dean's eyes cycled through several colors very quickly. Your species has traditional methods for solving cognitive reasoning matrix evaluations? Oh, we don't call them that, Hanul said. We call them Sudoku puzzles. People solve them for fun. They're in newspapers and magazines, and you can buy books full of them at any store. For a moment, Dean Korthak was completely silent. Her eyes had turned a color that Hanul had never seen before, something between purple and silver. People solve these for entertainment? She asked finally. Sure. My grandmother does 2 or 3 every morning while she drinks her coffee. Some people can solve them in just a few minutes. There are even competitions to see who can solve them fastest. The dean looked like she might be having some kind of internal crisis. And these competitions. How quickly can your experts solve problems of this complexity level? Hanul thought about the puzzle championship videos he had watched online. The world record holders can solve puzzles like this one in about 2 minutes. But they're really, really good. Most people take maybe 10 or 15 minutes for a puzzle this hard. Dean Korthak turned and walked away without another word. Hanul could see her having an urgent conversation with Professor Vax and several other faculty members. They kept looking back at him with expressions that seemed to mix amazement with something that might have been horror. He was starting to get the feeling that he had accidentally done something very significant, but he still was not sure what. Around the examination hall, the last of the injured students were being helped out by medical staff. The cleanup drones were already working to remove the various stress-related substances that different species had secreted during their cognitive breakdowns. Hanul sat in his chair and waited patiently for someone to tell him what to do next. He hoped he had not gotten himself kicked out of the exchange program. His grandmother would be disappointed if he came home early, especially after she had been so excited about him studying among the stars. He had no idea that he had just accidentally solved a 300-year-old mystery and was about to become the most famous human in the galaxy. Within an hour of the test ending, the Andromeda Institute of Higher Learning was in complete chaos. Word had spread through the quantum communication network faster than Dean Korthak could contain it. Faculty members were abandoning their classes to gather in the examination hall. Students from other departments were pressing against the windows, trying to get a glimpse of the human who had done the impossible. Hanul found himself moved to a smaller conference room while teams of academics ran verification protocols on his test results. Through the transparent walls, he could see clusters of professors having animated discussions in at least 6 different languages. Some were gesticulating wildly with whatever appendages their species used for emphasis. Others were projecting holographic mathematical models into the air. "This is unprecedented," he heard Professor Vax saying to a group of senior faculty. "In 3 centuries of administration, the highest completion rate achieved by any student was 14.7%. This human achieved 100% completion in under 90 minutes. A Nexarian professor with skin like shifting starlight interjected, "There must be an error in the evaluation system. Perhaps a quantum malfunction created false positive results." I ran the verification 17 times, came the reply from Dr. Zilton, the Institute's head of academic assessment. I used 3 different quantum computers and 2 backup analog systems. Every verification confirms the same result. The human's answers are mathematically perfect. Dean Korthak was coordinating what looked like a full investigation. Academic integrity officers were reviewing surveillance footage of the exam. Technology specialists were scanning for signs of cheating devices. Xenobiologists were analyzing Hanul's species data to look for previously unknown cognitive enhancements. Meanwhile, Hanul sat in the conference room with a cup of something that was supposed to be similar to Earth tea, but tasted like warm metal. He was starting to worry about missing his afternoon xenobiology class when Lee Dongmin burst through the door. "Hanul, what did you do?" his roommate asked in Korean, looking both excited and terrified. Lee Dongmin was a year older and had been at the institute for 2 semesters already. He was studying interstellar engineering and had warned Hanul about how competitive and intense the academic environment could be. "I just took a test," Hanul replied, also in Korean. "But I think I might have caused some kind of problem." "Problem? The entire university is talking about you. They're saying you broke some impossible math test that nobody has ever solved before." Through the transparent walls, they could see more faculty members arriving. Hanul recognized Professor Kess from his Introduction to Galactic Mathematics class and Dr. Vorthak, who taught advanced quantum theory. Even Rector Quinn Valdris, the head of the entire university, was making his way through the crowd. "Can you show me this test?" Dongmin asked. Hanul activated the room's display system and pulled up a practice version of the CRME. The screen filled with the same complex-looking symbols and mathematical notation that had confused everyone else. Dongmin stared at it for about 10 seconds, then started laughing. "Oh my God, Hanul. Oh my God! What? This is just Sudoku!" Dongmin's laughter was loud enough that several faculty members outside turned to look through the transparent walls. "Look," he said, pointing at the screen. "Ignore all the fancy symbols and alien writing. It's a 9x9 grid with some numbers filled in and some spaces empty. You have to put the numbers 1 through 9 in each row, each column, and each 3x3 box without repeating any numbers." "That's exactly what I did," Hanul said. "Of course that's what you did. It's Sudoku. My little sister Jiwoo could solve this." The door to the conference room slid open, and Dean Korthak entered with Rector Valdris and a small group of senior faculty. The rector was a Nexarian whose appearance commanded immediate respect. His skin shifted through patterns that looked like distant galaxies, and his 4 eyes seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. "Mr. Kim," the rector said in a voice that sounded like distant thunder, "we need to understand exactly how you approach the cognitive reasoning matrix evaluation." Before Hanul could answer, Dongmin spoke up in Standard Galactic. "Honored Rector, may I respectfully explain what happened here?" The gathered academics turned their attention to the second human. Dongmin walked to the display screen and began pointing out features of the test. "This assessment that your institution calls the Cognitive Reasoning Matrix Evaluation is identical to a puzzle form that is very common on Earth. We call it Sudoku. It was developed on our planet several centuries ago as a form of entertainment." The room fell completely silent. "Children learn to solve these puzzles in elementary school," Dongmin continued. "Adults solve them while riding public transportation or during breaks at work. You can buy books containing hundreds of these puzzles at any store on Earth." Professor Vax's 6 eyes were all focused on Dongmin with an intensity that was almost frightening. You are saying that humans regularly solve problems of this mathematical complexity for recreation? Yes, sir. This particular puzzle would be considered moderate difficulty. A skilled human could solve it in 5 to 10 minutes. Expert competitors can solve puzzles this complex in under 3 minutes. Dean Korthak's eyes had turned a color that Hanel was learning meant deep confusion. But the mathematical principles involved are enormously complex. The cognitive processing required should be beyond most species' capabilities. With respect, Dean Korthak, Dongmin said politely, I think there might be a misunderstanding about what makes this puzzle difficult. The mathematical principles are actually quite simple. You just need to use logical elimination and pattern recognition. Human brains happen to be good at both of those things. Rector Valdris stepped closer to the display. Show us, he said, simply. Dongmin pulled up a fresh version of the puzzle and began solving it step by step, explaining his reasoning in simple terms. This square can only be a 5, because all the other numbers are already used in this row. This square must be a 7, because it's the only number missing from this column. This square could be a 2 or a 6, so I'll look for other clues. As he worked, the gathered faculty members watched in amazement. What they had considered the galaxy's most challenging cognitive assessment was being solved by a second human student as casually as someone might explain how to tie their shoes. Within 12 minutes, Dongmin had completed the entire puzzle. The room was so quiet that Hanul could hear the air circulation system humming in the walls. Finally, Rector Valdris spoke. How many humans can solve these puzzles? Millions, Dongmin replied. Maybe hundreds of millions. Anyone can learn if they practice a little. The rector's skin patterns shifted to colors that Hanel had never seen before. Around the room, other faculty members were exhibiting various species-specific signs of shock, confusion, and what might have been existential crisis. Professor Vax was the first to recover his voice. The cognitive reasoning matrix evaluation has been the cornerstone of advanced mathematical assessment in this galaxy for 3 centuries. We have built entire academic theories around its impossibility. I'm really sorry, Hanul said quietly. I didn't mean to cause any problems. Rector Valdris looked at the 2 humans with an expression that was impossible to read. Mr. Kim, Mr. Lee, I believe you have just accidentally revolutionized our understanding of cognitive assessment. Outside the conference room, the crowd of faculty and students had grown even larger. News drones from academic journals were starting to arrive. The quantum communication channels were buzzing with requests for information from universities across the galaxy, and at the center of it all, 2 human exchange students were trying to explain that the galaxy's most impossible test was actually just a puzzle that people solved on the bus ride to work. By the next morning, the Andromeda Institute had been transformed into something resembling a crime scene investigation. Academic integrity officers from across the galaxy had arrived overnight, along with cognitive specialists, xenobiologists, and even temporal mechanics who wanted to rule out time travel cheating. Hanel found himself the subject of the most thorough examination he had ever experienced. They scanned his brain with 17 different types of neural imaging equipment. They analyzed his blood for performance-enhancing chemicals. They even checked his DNA to see if humans had somehow evolved hidden mathematical processing abilities. Every test came back the same, completely normal human, using only natural cognitive processes. Dr. Lisa Korthak had assembled a team of specialists in the Institute's main laboratory. The room was filled with equipment that hummed, beeped, and occasionally projected holographic displays of complex data. Hanul sat in the center of it all, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. Genetic analysis confirms standard human neural architecture, reported Dr. Fex, a Quellian biologist whose hive-mind connection allowed him to process multiple data streams simultaneously. No enhanced cognitive structures, no modified neurotransmitter. Production, no alien genetic markers. Temporal displacement scans are negative, added Professor Winth, a specialist in chronology who had traveled here from the Temporal Studies Institute. No evidence of future knowledge or causal loop manipulation. Brain imaging shows normal activity patterns for a human of his age, said Dr. Saris, whose crystalline Vithari body was designed for medical analysis. Neural firing rates are within expected parameters. No artificial enhancement detected. Dean Korthak studied the results with growing confusion. So we are confirming that a completely unenhanced human, using only natural cognitive abilities, solved a test that has stumped our best minds for 3 centuries. That appears to be correct, Dr. Fex replied. The dean turned to Hanul, who was trying to stay awake after hours of testing. Mr. Kim, I need you to explain your methodology one more time. In detail. Hanul rubbed his tired eyes. It's really not complicated. You look at each empty square and figure out what number can go there. If a row already has the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8, then the missing squares in that row must be 7 and 9. If one of those squares is in a column that already has a 9, then that square must be 7. And this process of elimination is sufficient for the entire assessment? Usually. Sometimes you have to make educated guesses and see if they work out, but mostly it's just logic. Dr. Korthak's eyes cycled through several colors rapidly. But the cognitive load of tracking all those variables simultaneously should be enormous. How do you maintain awareness of the constraints across multiple dimensional matrices? Hanul looked confused. I just remember what numbers are where. It's not really that hard to keep track of 9 numbers. The assembled scientists exchanged glances that conveyed their shared bewilderment. What the human described as not that hard represented a level of parallel processing that most species found overwhelming. Professor Vax entered the laboratory with another group of researchers. I have consulted with colleagues from 12 different academic institutions. The consensus is unanimous. What this human accomplished should be cognitively impossible for a single individual mind. But here's what I don't understand, said Dr. Winth, the temporal specialist. If humans can solve these puzzles easily, why did it take 3 centuries for anyone to recognize what the CRME actually was? Li Dongmin, who had been allowed to observe the investigation, raised his hand politely. May I answer that? Dean Korthak nodded. Humans have only been part of the galactic community for about 50 years, Dongmin explained. Before that, we didn't know these puzzles existed anywhere else. And when we started attending galactic universities, nobody mentioned that the big impossible test was actually just Sudoku with fancy symbols. Also, he continued, the way the test is presented makes it look much more complicated than it really is. All those alien symbols and mathematical terminology would confuse anyone who wasn't looking for the underlying pattern. Dr. Saris chimed softly, her crystalline body resonating with curiosity. This suggests that the difficulty of the assessment was largely based on presentation rather than inherent complexity. Exactly, Dongmin said. If you gave this same puzzle to a human child but wrote it in standard numbers on a simple grid, they could probably solve it in 20 minutes. But if you present it with complex alien symbols and call it a cognitive reasoning matrix evaluation, it looks impossible. The room fell quiet as the implications sank in. The galaxy's most prestigious academic challenge had been difficult primarily because of how it was presented, not because of what it actually required. Rector Valdris, who had been observing silently, finally spoke. Dr. Korthak, I want you to conduct an experiment. Take 10 standard Sudoku puzzles from Earth databases and present them to our best mathematics students using normal notation. See how they perform. And take 10 more puzzles, added Professor Vax, and present them using the same complex symbols and terminology we use for the CRME. Give those to human students and see if the presentation affects their performance. Dean. Korthak nodded. I'll have the results by tomorrow. As the meeting began to break up, Dr. Fex approached Hanul with curiosity radiating from his collective consciousness. Mr. Kim, I have been wondering about something. You solved this puzzle using techniques that your grandmother taught you. Are there other problem-solving methods that humans learn as children? Hanul thought about it. Well, there are lots of, different puzzles and games. Crossword puzzles, chess, Go, logic problems, word games, number sequences. And humans learn these for entertainment? Sure. Some people really enjoy puzzles. My grandmother has shelves full of puzzle books. She says they keep her mind sharp. Dr. Fex's multiple minds seemed to be processing this information rapidly. Would it be possible to examine some of these other human puzzle forms? I guess so. Dongmin probably has some puzzle apps on his tablet. Within minutes, Dongmin was demonstrating chess, Go, crossword puzzles, and various logic games to a room full of fascinated alien academics. Each puzzle form seemed to challenge different cognitive abilities, and the assembled scientists were taking detailed notes on human problem-solving approaches. This is remarkable, Dr. Saris observed. Your species has developed recreational activities that train multiple forms of logical reasoning, pattern recognition, and strategic thinking. While most species focus their educational efforts on narrow specializations, added Professor Vax, humans seem to engage in broad cognitive exercise as a form of entertainment. Hanal was starting to realize that his accidental solution to the CRME was part of something much larger. Human puzzle-solving abilities were not just different from other species, they were developed in ways that the galactic academic community had never encountered before. As the day wore on, more researchers arrived from universities across the galaxy. They all wanted to understand how a species that had been considered intellectually average had managed to solve a problem that had defeated the greatest minds in known space. And at the center of it all, Kim Hanul just wanted to get back to his regular classes and maybe call his grandmother to tell her that her puzzle lessons had gotten him into the most complicated situation of his life. The experimental results arrived exactly 24 hours later, and they shattered what remained of the galactic academic community's understanding of cognitive assessment. Dean Korthak stood before a packed auditorium, holding a data tablet that contained information capable of rewriting textbooks across the galaxy. Faculty members from dozens of species filled every seat, while holographic projections allowed thousands more to observe from universities throughout known space. The results of our controlled experiments are unambiguous, she announced, her eyes shifting to the deep blue color that indicated complete certainty. When presented with standard Sudoku notation, 73% of our advanced mathematics students were able to complete the puzzles successfully. A murmur rippled through the audience. These were the same students who routinely failed the CRME with completion rates below 15%. Furthermore, Dean Korthak continued. When we presented identical puzzles to human students using the complex symbolic notation of the CRME, their completion rate dropped to only 41%, and their average completion time increased by a factor of 3. The implications were staggering. The galaxy's most challenging academic assessment had been difficult primarily because of its presentation, not because of any inherent mathematical complexity. Professor Vax stood to address the assembly. We must acknowledge what this means for our understanding of cognitive evaluation. For 3 centuries, we have been measuring students' ability to decode unnecessary complexity rather than testing actual problem-solving skills. In the front row, Rector Valdris was receiving constant updates on his personal communication device. The story had spread beyond academic circles and was now being reported across the galactic news networks. Headlines like, "Impossible Test Solved," "By Human Child's Game," and 3 centuries of academic pride destroyed by Earth puzzle were being broadcast to billions of beings. The Hegemony University of Advanced Learning had issued a statement questioning the validity of all CRME-based research conducted over the past 300 years. The Nexarian Institute of Higher Mathematics had suspended their graduate program pending a complete review of their assessment methods. Stock prices for companies that manufactured CRME preparation materials had collapsed overnight. But the most significant reaction was coming from individual academics who had built their entire careers around the impossibility of the test. Dr. Malthane Koros, a Therian professor who had written the definitive textbook on CRME theory, was found in his office staring blankly at a simple Sudoku puzzle that his research assistant had printed out for him. He had been sitting there for 6 hours, unable to process the fact that the impossible mathematical construct he had spent 40 years studying was actually a children's game. Professor Kellix Vorthane, who held the galactic record for highest CRME completion rate at 14.7%, had barricaded herself in her laboratory and was reportedly working through hundreds of Sudoku puzzles with an intensity that worried her colleagues. The Crystalline Academy of Pure Mathematics had declared a month-long period of academic reflection after their entire faculty realized that their most challenging examination could be solved by any human teenager with a pencil and 15 minutes of free time. Meanwhile, Kim Hanul was trying to eat lunch in the Institute's cafeteria while being stared at by hundreds of students and faculty members. Every few minutes, someone would approach his table and ask him to solve a puzzle, explain his thinking, or demonstrate his impossible abilities. "I really don't understand why everyone is so excited," he told Dongmin in Korean. "It's just Sudoku." "That's exactly why they're excited," Dongmin replied. "Imagine if you spent your whole life thinking that climbing a mountain was impossible, and then you found out that children from another planet climb that same mountain for fun on weekends." A group of Quellian students approached their table, moving with the synchronized precision that indicated they were sharing thoughts through their hive-mind connection. Their spokesman, a being whose name translated roughly to harmonious unity of mathematical thought, addressed Hanul with obvious reverence. "Honored human who solves the impossible," the Quellian said, "our combined consciousness seeks to understand your cognitive methodology. How does a single mind process the vast complexity of the great mathematical assessment?" Hanul looked helplessly at Dongmin. "Could you explain it to them?" "I keep trying to tell people it's not complicated, but nobody believes me." Before Dongmin could answer, another commotion erupted across the cafeteria. A group of faculty members had surrounded Professor Kess, who was holding what appeared to be a children's puzzle book from Earth. "This cannot be accurate, Professor," Kess was saying in a voice loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. These puzzle books claim to contain over 500 problems of CRME-level complexity. That would represent more mathematical challenges than our entire academic consortium has developed in 3 centuries. Dean Korthak, who had just entered the cafeteria, approached the group. Professor Kess, that appears to be a standard Earth puzzle publication. They are available in any human convenience store for the equivalent of about 2 galactic credits. The professor's tentacles writhed in distress. 2 credits? 2 credits for 500 impossible mathematical challenges? They're not impossible, Hanul called out from his table, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet cafeteria. They're just puzzles. Some are easy, some are hard, but they're all solvable if you know the rules. Every being in the cafeteria turned to stare at him. The weight of their attention was overwhelming, but Hanul had reached his limit of trying to explain something that seemed obvious to him. "Look," he said, standing up so everyone could hear him clearly. "I know this is strange for you, but on Earth, these puzzles are everywhere. My grandmother does them every morning. My little sister does them when she's bored. People solve them on trains, in waiting rooms, during their lunch breaks." He paused, looking around at the sea of alien faces watching him with expressions ranging from amazement to confusion to something that might have been fear. "The only reason I could solve your test is because I've been doing these puzzles since I was 7 years old. It's like, if you gave me a test in Quellian hive mind mathematics, I would fail completely. But if you gave a Quellian a test in human puzzle solving, they would probably fail too. We're all good at different things." The cafeteria remained silent for a long moment. Then Professor Vax stepped forward, his 6 eyes focused intently on Hanul. "Mr. Kim," he said slowly, "are you suggesting that cognitive ability is not universal but rather specialized to different forms of thinking?" "I guess so," Hanul replied. "I mean, I can't do the things that other species are good at. I can't calculate quantum probabilities in my head like Nexarians, or process multiple data streams like Quellians, or analyze molecular structures like Vithari. I can just solve these particular kinds of puzzles because that's what human brains happen to be good at." The silence that followed this statement was so complete that Hanul could hear his own heartbeat. Finally, Rector Valdris spoke from the back of the cafeteria. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of all classifications," he said in his voice like distant thunder, "I believe we have just witnessed the most important insight in educational theory in over 1,000 years." And with those words, the old understanding of intelligence and cognitive assessment began to crumble, replaced by something far more complex and far more interesting than anyone had imagined possible. Within a week, the story had spread to every inhabited system in the galaxy. The Galactic News Network ran continuous coverage with headlines like "The Great Mathematical Hoax" and "3 Centuries of Academic Pride Reduced to Children's Puzzle." Comedy shows on a dozen worlds were making jokes about university professors who couldn't solve games that human children played for fun. The Viridian University of Advanced Mathematics faced the most immediate crisis. For over 2 centuries, their motto had been, "Where the CRME remains unconquered." Now they had to explain to prospective students why their most prestigious selling point was actually just ignorance of a common Earth puzzle. Emergency marketing. Meetings were called across the galaxy as academic institutions scrambled to rebrand themselves. The Consortium of Higher Mathematical Learning quietly removed all references to the CRME from their promotional materials. The Advanced Cognitive Sciences Institute began offering refunds to students who had paid premium tuition specifically to attempt the impossible test. But not everyone reacted with embarrassment. Dr. Lisa Korthak had become obsessed with human cognitive architecture. Her office was now filled with puzzle books, games, and examples of human recreational problem-solving activities. She had spent the past 3 days working through chess problems, crossword puzzles, and logic games with the intensity of someone discovering a new form of mathematics. "This is extraordinary," she told her research team during their daily meeting. "Humans have developed recreational activities that exercise multiple forms of cognitive processing simultaneously. Their puzzle-solving methods could revolutionize how we approach education across all species." Her enthusiasm was shared by researchers throughout the galaxy. The Quellian Collective had begun studying human game theory, trying to understand how individual minds could develop strategic thinking without hive mind support. The Nexarian Institute was investigating human pattern recognition abilities, amazed that a single brain could track complex relationships without quantum processing enhancement. Even the normally reserved Arcturian Academy had issued a statement, acknowledging that their understanding of intelligence had been profoundly limited by species-centric assumptions. Meanwhile, Kim Hannell had become the most famous human in the galaxy, though he was handling his celebrity status with typical confusion. Representatives from universities across known space were offering him full scholarships, research positions, and honorary degrees. Publishers wanted him to write books about human problem-solving techniques. Entertainment companies were trying to license his story for holographic dramas. "I just solved a puzzle," he kept telling reporters. "I don't understand why everyone is so excited." His grandmother, Park Myung, had become something of a celebrity herself back on Earth. News crews from across the galaxy were interviewing her about her teaching methods and her collection of puzzle books. She handled the attention with the same patient dignity she had used to teach Hanul mathematics all those years ago. "Hanul was always a good student," she told a reporter from the Centauri broadcasting system. "But he is not special because he can solve puzzles. He is special because he is kind and works hard and cares about others. That is more important than any test." The interview had been broadcast across the galaxy and had somehow become even more famous than Hanul's original achievement. Philosophers and educators were analyzing her words, finding profound wisdom in the simple statement that character mattered more than test scores. Back at the Andromeda Institute, the academic community was undergoing the most significant transformation in its history. The CRME had been officially retired, but rather than simply replacing it with another test, the faculty was developing an entirely new approach to assessment. "We have learned that intelligence is not universal," announced Rector Valdris during a galaxy-wide academic conference. "Different species excel at different forms of cognitive processing. Our new evaluation methods will recognize and celebrate this diversity rather than trying to force all minds into a single narrow definition of ability. The new assessment system would include problems designed to challenge different types of thinking. Spatial reasoning tests for species like humans, quantum probability challenges for Nexarians, harmonic analysis for Vithari, collective processing exercises for Quellians, and dozens of other cognitive categories that had never been formally recognized before. But the most significant change was philosophical. For the first time in galactic academic history, students would be evaluated based on their own species' cognitive strengths, rather than measured against a universal standard that had never actually been universal at all. Professor Vax, whose career had been built around the impossibility of the CRME, had initially struggled with the revelations, but now he was leading one of the most exciting research projects in the galaxy, a comprehensive study of cognitive diversity across all known species. We spent 3 centuries trying to solve the wrong problem, he told his research team. We were so focused on proving that the test was impossible that we never asked whether it should be possible, or whether its difficulty was actually measuring what we thought it was measuring. His preliminary results were already showing remarkable discoveries. Therion minds excelled at processing sequential information in ways that other species found difficult. Cephalian cognition included forms of parallel processing that were completely different from Quellian hive mind thinking. Even species that had been considered academically average showed exceptional abilities when evaluated using appropriate methods. The research was revealing that intelligence was far more varied and interesting than anyone had previously imagined. Li Dongmin had become something of an expert on human puzzle culture, giving lectures and demonstrations across the galaxy. His presentations on chess, Go, crossword puzzles, and logic games were drawing massive audiences of academics eager to understand how humans had developed such diverse recreational problem-solving activities. The key insight, he explained to a packed auditorium at the Nexarian Institute, is that humans created these puzzles for entertainment, not as academic exercises. This meant they had to be engaging and accessible, which led to elegant simplicity rather than artificial complexity. The implications were profound. By focusing on entertainment rather than difficulty, humans had accidentally developed more effective cognitive training tools than species that had approached problem-solving as a purely academic pursuit. As the weeks passed, the initial embarrassment of the CRME revelation began to transform into something more positive. Genuine excitement about the possibilities that cognitive diversity represented. Universities were establishing exchange programs specifically designed to expose students to different forms of thinking. Puzzle clubs were forming on campuses across the galaxy. Academic conferences were featuring presentations on recreational mathematics and cognitive cross-training. The galaxy's greatest mathematical mystery had been solved by a 19-year-old human with a grandmother who liked puzzles. But the real discovery was not about mathematics at all. It was about the beautiful complexity of intelligence itself, and the amazing things that could happen when different minds came together to learn from each other. 6 months after Kim Hanul accidentally solved the galaxy's most famous mathematical puzzle, the universe looked very different. The Andromeda Institute of Higher Learning had become the center of a revolution in educational theory. Students from hundreds of worlds came to study in the new Department of Cognitive Diversity, where they learned not just their own species' traditional subjects, but also problem-solving methods from dozens of other cultures. Hanul had settled into his unexpected role as a bridge between human and alien ways of thinking. His weekly lectures on recreational problem-solving in human culture were broadcast to universities across the galaxy, and his patient explanations of puzzle logic had helped thousands of students develop new cognitive skills. Today's lecture was particularly special because his family had come to visit. Park Mi-young sat in the front row of the packed auditorium, beaming with pride as her grandson explained the basics of crossword puzzles to an audience that included some of the galaxy's most brilliant minds. Next to her, Hanul's younger brother, Park Sun-ho, was trying not to laugh at the sight of a six-eyed Krillian professor struggling with a word puzzle designed for human 8-year-olds. The key to crossword puzzles, Hanul was explaining, is understanding that they work on multiple levels simultaneously. You need vocabulary knowledge, pattern recognition, cultural awareness, and the ability to think about language in creative ways. A Quellian student raised a tentacle. But how does an individual mind process all these variables without collective cognitive support? Practice mostly, Haniel replied. Humans start doing these puzzles when they're children, so we develop the mental skills gradually. It's like learning to walk. It seems impossible until you learn how to do it, and then it becomes natural. He demonstrated by solving a simple crossword puzzle projected on the large display screen. As he worked through the clues, explaining his reasoning at each step, the audience watched with the fascination typically reserved for advanced mathematical proofs. 5 letters, morning beverage, he read aloud. That's probably coffee, but let me check the crossing words to be sure. Professor Vax, who had become one of Hanel's strongest supporters, was taking detailed notes. His research on cognitive diversity had already revolutionized assessment methods at 17 major universities, and he was constantly discovering new aspects of human problem-solving that could benefit other species. After the lecture, the family gathered in the Institute's gardens for a private celebration. It was Hanul's 20th birthday, though the date meant little to most alien species who measured time differently. I'm proud of you, Hanola, his grandmother said in Korean, squeezing his hand. Not because you solved some big test, but because you've helped so many people learn new ways to think. I still don't really understand what I did, Hanoel admitted. I just solved a Sudoku puzzle. Sunho laughed. You solved a Sudoku puzzle that an entire galaxy thought was impossible. That's like accidentally proving that water flows downhill when everyone else thought it flowed uphill. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dean Korthak, whose eyes had developed a new color pattern that Hanul had learned meant deep contentment. She had become one of the leading experts on interspecies cognitive exchange, and her research was reshaping educational theory across the galaxy. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said politely, but I wanted to share some news with Hanul and his family. She activated a holographic display that showed statistical data from universities across known space. Since we introduced diverse assessment methods 6 months ago, student performance has improved dramatically across all measured categories. More importantly, cross-species collaboration has increased by over 300%. The implications were staggering. By recognizing that different minds worked differently, rather than trying to force everyone into the same cognitive framework, the galaxy's educational system had become dramatically more effective. But the most interesting development, Dean, Korthak continued, is what's happening with puzzle culture. Sudoku clubs have formed on over 2,000 worlds. Chess tournaments are being organized between species that had never interacted before. Logic puzzle competitions have become one of the most popular forms of interstellar entertainment. Park Myung chuckled. So my puzzle books have conquered the galaxy? In a sense, yes, the dean replied with obvious amusement. Though it's more accurate to say that your grandson's demonstration has shown us that intelligence is far more interesting and varied than we ever imagined. As evening approached, the family walked through the Institute's campus, which had been transformed by the integration of cognitive diversity principles. Study groups mixed students from different species, each contributing their unique problem-solving approaches. Recreation areas included puzzle stations designed for various types of minds. The library had expanded to include game and puzzle collections from hundreds of worlds. They passed a group of Nexarian students working on human-style crossword puzzles while a human student attempted to solve a Nexarian quantum probability matrix. Both groups were struggling, but they were also laughing and helping each other with obvious enjoyment. It's beautiful, Sunho observed. Everyone is still being themselves, but they're also learning from each other. That's the point, Hanoel replied. We don't all have to be the same to work together. We just have to understand and respect how different minds work. Their walk took them past the memorial that had been erected to commemorate the CRME revelation. The plaque read, "In recognition that the greatest discoveries often come from the simplest questions, and that wisdom can be found in the most unexpected places." Below the inscription was a simple 9x9 Sudoku grid, partially filled with numbers in the standard human notation. It had become something of a pilgrimage site for academics from across the galaxy, a reminder that assumptions should always be questioned, and that complexity was not the same as difficulty. As they prepared to return to their quarters, Professor Vax approached the group with obvious excitement. "Hanul, I've just received a communication from the Temporal Studies Institute. They want to know if humans have any puzzles involving time-based logic." Hanul looked at his family with amusement. "Well, there are logic puzzles that involve sequences and timing, and chess problems where you have to think several moves ahead," Sunho added. "Oh, and those puzzle games where you have to figure out the order that things happened," their grandmother contributed helpfully. Professor Vax's 6 eyes lit up with anticipation. "Would it be possible to arrange a demonstration?" "Sure," Hanul said. "But you should probably prepare your temporal mechanics for the possibility that their impossible time logic problems might turn out to be something that human children solve for fun." The professor's expression suggested that this possibility filled him with more excitement than concern. The revelation that human recreational activities might hold solutions to other impossible galactic challenges had become a source of eager anticipation rather than embarrassment. As the family finally headed back to their accommodations, Hanul reflected on how much his life had changed. He had come to the Institute as a nervous exchange student, worried about keeping up with alien classmates who seemed so much more advanced than humans. Instead, he had discovered that humans brought their own unique strengths to the galactic community. Not better than other species, but different in ways that could complement and enhance the abilities of others. His story had become part of galactic folklore, the human who solved the impossible test and accidentally taught the universe that intelligence was not a competition, but a collaboration. And in quiet moments like this, walking through gardens under alien stars with his family beside him, Hanul understood that the most important lesson had nothing to do with mathematics or puzzles or tests. It was about the beauty of minds coming together, each contributing their own special gifts to create something greater than any one species could achieve alone. The galaxy had learned to celebrate cognitive diversity, and Kim Hanul had learned that sometimes the most profound discoveries came from simply being yourself in a universe full of different ways of thinking. His grandmother had been right all along. A good mind worked best when you used it the way it was made to work. But the real magic happened when different kinds of minds worked together, each one teaching the others new ways to see the world.